Well, you're watching BBC News. Let's take you back now to RAF Bryce Norton, because we've just been watching that plane coming in from China, from Wuhan, the centre, the epicenter really of the outbreak of the coronavirus. And that plane carrying 83 British nationals and 27 other foreign nationals landing in Britain after flying from Wuhan, the centre of the coronavirus epidemic that so far killed more than 200 people in China and infected more than 9,000. The plane, you can see it there on the runway at the RAF base at Bryce Norton. And once the passengers have been taken off the plane, they're going to be taken to a National Health Service facility where they will be in quarantine for 14 days, so 2 weeks in quarantine for all those people on the plane. And then the plane will continue on to Spain, where the home countries of European citizens, European Union citizens, will take responsibility for the remaining passengers. There was some chaos and confusion about who was getting on that plane. We heard of families where British citizens were separated from relatives, from family members who are not British citizens, who are Chinese citizens. So some degree of confusion about who could get on that plane and who couldn't. There were 200 people of British nationalities, we were told, who were in Wuhan. And of those 283 British citizens are actually on that plane. So not all of those British nationals who were in Wuhan have actually got onto that plane. And all of this, of course, comes as we've had the first 2 cases confirmed in the UK of the new strain of coronavirus. Those 2 people from the same family who have had been staying in a hotel in Yorkshire, we're told, are now being treated at an NHS hospital in Newcastle that specialises in infectious diseases. We can go to Caroline Davis, our correspondent who's at RAF Bryce Norton, watching these pictures as that plane just taxis on the runway at RAF Bryce Norton. So Caroline, just talk us through then in a bit more detail about what's going to happen now with the people on that plane.
Well then, as you said, there are 83 British nationals on board, 27 foreign nationals. There are some EU citizens on there as well. We understand that they will then be flown on that plane onwards to Spain. I think we believe that it's going to Madrid. However, the British families will be evacuated off that plane. The screening process that they go through next isn't entirely clear. They have had medics on board who've been monitoring their conditions. Anyone who has felt unwell has been able to speak to those medics. At the moment, we've not heard any suggestion that there is any person who is suffering from the coronavirus on board that plane. Those individuals will then be taken from here by bus to the Wirral. It's about 170 miles northwest of here. They'll be in Arrow Park Hospital. Now, we understand that they are being kept, or they will be kept, in empty staff accommodation at that hospital, not part of the hospital itself. We are waiting to hear more information about how those people are on board that plane.
And as I was saying, there was a degree of confusion about who actually could get on this plane from Wuhan.
Well, originally we'd been told that there would be 150 British nationals on board that plane, that there would be 50 EU nationals. So the number of 83 British nationals on board is much lower. The reason why that number is so much lower is not entirely clear. We heard that a lot of the time Brits were told very last minute that they were able to speak to they were told very last minute that they would be able to travel, with their families, that they wouldn't be split between those who had Chinese passports and dual nationality. It seems that we were able to have families that were able to travel together. However, some people found out about it too late. They struggled to get transport to get to the airport, and so they were unable to make that plane. We understand that those people are still in touch with the Foreign Office.
And Caroline, all of this, as I was saying, comes at a time when we've had the first confirmation of British cases of coronavirus. We've had 2 people who've been confirmed as having coronavirus in the United Kingdom, and we gather that they've been staying at a hotel in Yorkshire. They're now being treated at a hospital in Newcastle. What more about that have health officials been saying?
Well, we understand that these are two members of the same family, that we do know that they are being treated in Newcastle. We know that they were identified last night. And that at the moment is the information that we have about these particular individuals. We haven't had a nationality confirmed for those individuals. We don't know how long they, whether they are British nationals, whether they are from China, whether they have come directly from Wuhan. Though that information is still not clear yet. We are waiting for more information. We have also heard from UK health sources about the mortality rate for the coronavirus. It's around sort of 2% is the sort of level they're putting it at, which by comparison to SARS and Ebola is significantly lower. SARS was around 10%, whereas Ebola was around a 70% mortality rate. So quite significantly lower than both of those infections.
Caroline, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's just continue to watch these pictures of this plane that has now arrived from Wuhan in China. It's now taxiing there, as you can see, at RAF Bryce Norton with 83 British nationals on board and a number of other foreign nationals who've been evacuated from China because of the coronavirus outbreak, which has so far killed some 200 people in China and infected about 9,000 others. Just a bit more detail on the confirmation that two Britons here have been confirmed to have the coronavirus, and as Caroline was just telling us, they've been taken to a hospital in Newcastle, the Newcastle Royal Victoria Infirmary, where they're undergoing treatment. We've had a statement earlier on from the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty. Let me just read you a bit of that. The patients are receiving specialist NHS care. We are using tried and tested infection control procedures to prevent the further spread of the virus. And Professor Whitty also saying the NHS is extremely well prepared and used to managing infections. We are already working rapidly to identify any contacts the patients had to prevent further spread. We've been preparing for UK cases of this coronavirus, this new strain of the coronavirus. We have robust infection control measures in place to respond immediately. So that's the situation with those two members of the same family who've been taken to that hospital in Newcastle. And Caroline Davis at Bryce Norton, we're just awaiting the moment then when these passengers will get off this plane after a very long flight, and of course a number of days in which they've been more or less, holed up in their flats and apartments in Wuhan because they were very worried about contracting coronavirus.
Well, you can imagine this has been almost a very surreal experience for most of those individuals on that flight. They left Wuhan around 9:45 a.m. local time this morning, and from all of the sort of testimony that we've heard from people who are in Wuhan, the streets closed off. You can see images that we've seen of people trying to get to the airport, of entirely empty streets, of health screenings before they get into the airport itself. This must feel very strange to suddenly be leaving Wuhan and be in Britain, particularly facing 2 weeks of quarantine. At the moment, we don't have a huge amount of information what that quarantine will involve, whether those individuals will be kept in separate rooms, whether they will be allowed to socialise with each other. We do just know that they will be kept in quarantine for 14 days to see if there are any risk of the infection, if they are suffering from coronavirus. So we are still waiting to hear, and I imagine they will have plenty of questions when they get off the flight about exactly what happens to them next.
Yeah, but as we understand it, Caroline, that there's a minimum period of 14 days of in that facility in Wirral where they're being taken. Because initially the government were talking about self-isolation for people who were coming back from Wuhan and areas of China where the coronavirus had spread to.
Yes, so they will be in quarantine for those for the minimum, as you say, of 14 days in the Wirral, in this sort of staff accommodation that has been separated off from the hospital that is currently empty. Whether if one of those individuals then shows signs of the coronavirus, if that means that the entire group will have to be kept for longer, and to see if they have any symptoms as well before they're released, that isn't entirely clear. I imagine those are the sort of plans that the health authorities will be drawing up at the moment as well.
So let's just remind viewers we're watching live pictures from RAF Bryce Norton of the plane that has just arrived in the last few minutes, carrying 83 British nationals, also 27 foreign nationals. That's just landed at RAF Bryce Norton after that special flight from the city of Wuhan in central China. And that, of course, has been the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak that has so far killed more than 200 people, infected more than 9,000 in China. It's thought to have started in an illegal wildlife market in Wuhan. And the British government have brought those people home. The plane arriving there just before 1:30. And as Caroline Davis has been telling us, they're going to be now taken to a National Health Service facility in Wirral, where they will be in 14 days of isolation, in quarantine. And then the plane will carry on to Spain, to Madrid, we're told. And that's where the other passengers who are not British will be taken off the plane. And Caroline, as we've been saying, I suppose mixed feelings for the people on this plane. Relief to get out of Wuhan, but I suppose huge disruption for them and their families at having to leave China at such short notice and in such sad and alarming circumstances.
Well, you can imagine for many of them, they've been having constant conversations with the Foreign Office, deliberating, particularly for those families that have dual nationals in, about whether they can come, making decisions about whether they want to take the plane or not. Of course, some people are concerned that if there is somebody else on board the plane that has coronavirus, is sitting in a long-haul flight with those individuals the safest option. Of course, many people have been, at home, not leaving the house, stuck indoors, making these sorts of very difficult decisions. I mean, to decide whether or not you would stay in that situation, whether some of your family would be able to leave. We have also heard that there are some messages on social media of people that had been talking about leaving Wuhan and how they felt that they had a privilege, because many people who are obviously national to Wuhan, who are living there, can't leave. They don't have that option. And so many people who've got a life in Wuhan, who have neighbours, who have a community there, are now being sort of pulled out and have made the decision to come back to the UK. So yes, I can imagine a lot of different emotions for people as they come off the plane.
And just the latest figures on the coronavirus outbreak, just to bring you those, we're hearing the death toll in China has now risen to 213, and the number of known cases has risen to 9,962. No deaths have so far occurred outside China, but cases have been confirmed across at least 23 different countries, and added to that list is now the United Kingdom, because we know those 2 cases confirmed of 2 members of the same family who had been staying in a hotel in Yorkshire, who are now being treated in Newcastle. Just to say also, the number of coronavirus cases around the world has surpassed that of the SARS epidemic, but the mortality rate is thought to be lower than SARS, suggesting it is a less deadly disease than SARS. But this is the evacuation of British and other foreign nationals from Wuhan. Many other countries, Australia, South Korea, Singapore, New Zealand, have said that they are planning to quarantine evacuees as well for 2 weeks. So the same practices we're adopting here in the UK to avoid the spread of the virus. The British passengers on this evacuation flight have been mainly in the city of Wuhan and the surrounding Hubei province. They had to sign, before they got on board, a contract agreeing to isolation before they could get on board that flight. The Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jenny Harris, has been saying that everybody who's got on the plane is a well passenger, if any of those passengers do show symptoms, there are set procedures to isolate them during any process and remove them in any part of the journey. You can see actually just around the plane some ambulances there standing by to take the passengers off to Wirral from Bryce Norton, where they're going to be taken to that NHS facility in Wirral, where they will be kept for 14 days in isolation. We can speak now to Peter Holden, who's the British Medical Association's emergency preparedness leader. Peter, just talk us through then what is going on now and why it's been felt necessary to bring these evacuees home and then to put them into 14 days of isolation.
Well, I think the reason to bring people home is it can't be much fun being in a foreign city that is locked down. And that will be the reason you bring them home. Why the 14 days isolation? Well, you don't want it to spread, and I'm sure the politicians wouldn't want to be accused of, well, you imported it to this country, didn't you? I think that that's common sense, that it's 14 days isolation, and in fact, it's consistent with the kind of guidance that has been issued about those who may have been exposed who are awaiting a test. It's 14 days to get the test, is the situation. Sorry, 14 days before you can say that it's unlikely that you've got coronavirus. Mass testing for coronavirus isn't yet available, is my understanding. You are probably ahead of me. I've just done a morning surgery for the last 5 hours, so it was news to me that there are 2 UK positive cases.
I mean, I know you're not an expert on coronavirus, but how would you say, how worrying, how alarming is this virus compared to other epidemics we've seen, like the SARS epidemic or Ebola, for example? How concerned should people be?
Only the same concern as for any other infectious disease. We don't want them spreading needlessly. And I do think that there is a degree of hype going on in the media at the moment about this. It is a disease that's got a 2.13% mortality. Now, there's plenty of things that carry higher mortality than that, but we don't even bat an eyelid at. And I think we need to have that in perspective. In a country of, what is it, 1 billion people in China? 9,962 cases. And it's handfuls in other countries. And this is in an era of mass transportation. So I think that, yes, I think the reason that people are worried is there's a degree of concern that this has been going on for longer than has been admitted. But I think we should have it in perspective. This is simple common sense when faced with an infectious disease. We all know with infectious disease, you isolate. You do it with your children with measles, you do it with your children with chickenpox, you don't go out and deliberately infect others.
So these are sensible precautions from the government, in your view?
Yes, they are. And, you know, how else would people feel if you brought a plane load of people over and just let them loose into the community? You then have a massive problem tracing who they'd seen. Remember, we've not got fully characterised this virus in terms of its behaviour, which is the reason you've got to err on the side of safety, which is 14 days of isolation. Now, the problem is the government doesn't want people to say, oh, I'll self-isolate and then just please themselves. And that's why they've done this. Because this isn't just the to and fro of normal mercantile and commercial activity. This is deliberately bringing home a plane load of people from an infected area. And that is a very sensible response when faced with this. There will be people who after the event will say it was overblown, but they won't be the people who have the responsibility of taking the decisions.
And these people, we're just watching pictures, Peter Holden from the BMA, we're watching pictures of the plane on the runway there and ambulance staff lining up to take the evacuees on to Wirral. It seems quite a long journey, doesn't it, to take them from Bryce Norton to Arrow Park Hospital in Wirral for quarantine. I would have thought maybe there were other places nearer Bryce Norton, or is that a very specialist hospital that they're going to in Wirral?
Health service facilities remember, I don't know how many people are on this plane, but to suddenly find several dozen beds in a healthcare facility that altogether can be isolated is not an everyday occurrence. So what you will do is see the sorts of places that can produce those kind of facilities and then see who can do it at the minimum disruption. Remember, all emergency preparedness is actually about business continuity management, and it's about how we keep the rest of everything running as well. So it's not necessarily it's a long way. It's a hop, skip and a jump compared to distance that just floats.
Peter Holden from the BMA, thank you. Just a little bit more information about where they're going to be taken as we see the door of the plane opening there. The passengers are going to be taken by bus to Arrow Park Hospital in Wirral for quarantine of 14 days, and they'll be housed in an NHS accommodation block with access to the internet, we're told. They'll be given fully furnished rooms, food, laundry facilities, and they'll have access to a team of medical staff who will closely monitor their condition. Kitchens will be available for those who wish to self-cater. And anyone with suspicious symptoms will then be taken to the Royal Liverpool and Broad Green Hospital. So that is the latest then on that evacuation of those British nationals from Wuhan in central China. We'll bring you more on it throughout the afternoon. Now though, look at the weather with Thomas Schaffenacker. Hello everybody, this is Afternoon Live, I'm Ben Brown. The first cases of the new coronavirus have been confirmed in the United Kingdom. Health officials say 2 people from the same family who had been staying at a hotel in Yorkshire are now being treated in a hospital in Newcastle. Well, so far the virus has killed more than 200 people in China and infected around 9,000 more. Meanwhile, a plane has arrived at RAF Bryce Norton carrying 83 British nationals who've been evacuated from Wuhan. That's the Chinese city at the centre of the outbreak. From there, they will be transferred to a quarantine facility on the Wirral, and they'll be there for the next 14 days at least. We can speak now to Ben Williams, who's on that plane at RAF Bryce Norton. Ben Williams, if you can hear me, thank you very much for joining us. Just talk us through your experience of the last 24 hours. How's the flight been and what's happening next?
Hello, nice to be there. Certainly been an experience. Sheer distance I had to cover in not a lot of time to catch this flight. I think I had to do about 450 kilometres and go through multiple lockdown areas just to get on the lovely flight. The staff on this flight have been absolutely amazing. It is a very basic flight, not much quality, but I think all the staff made up for that. It's been quite a good experience.
And Ben, what have you been told about what happens to you next?
At the moment we're out on the plane, they're going to call our names in alphabetical order. We leave the plane one by one or in family for health screening. And then I believe just get on a happy coach to our final destination for our extended vacation.
Weeks in isolation, how are you feeling about that?
I think I'll be alright as long as I can get some exercise to try and burn off my natural thermal layer.
What are your feelings about, leaving, being evacuated from China, from Wuhan? Were you pleased? Are you relieved to have got out, or do you have mixed feelings?
Very much mixed feelings. I was planned to leave originally on the 1st, but after multiple flights being cancelled and multiple lockdowns being in place, I think it's good to be back, but I also miss China as well.
What were you doing in China?
I was actually completing my marriage and honeymoon.
Right, so you were there on honeymoon?
Yeah, and my wedding was there as well.
Okay, and so have you come back with your new wife?
Sadly, sadly we came to the decision to either stay behind due to the very much short notice they gave us for the flight. They literally told us about 9 o'clock in the evening, and we spent about an hour and a half to some paperwork mistakes between embassies, and by the time we were out the door, it was very much a close call to get to the meeting point to get on this flight. So sadly, my wife had nothing prepared, and it wasn't right for her to enter the UK with essentially nothing.
So you've been split up then by this evacuation?
Yeah, temporarily.
And is she a Chinese national, your wife, or a British national? Is that why that happened?
Yeah, Chinese national. Yeah, I believe that's why it's happened. They did tell us very much last minute that she would be allowed on the flight, but by the time they told us, we had nothing arranged.
So you might not see her again for a while now.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's only less than a few months. But to be honest, we've been in a long distance relationship. UK to Brazil for the last 2 years, so a couple of months and nothing.
So Ben, you're still sitting on the plane. Have any of your fellow evacuees, any of the other passengers, have they got off yet, or are you all just sitting on it?
I believe we're all sitting ducks at the moment. No one's moved flight yet.
What's the mood of the other people you're with? I think 83 British nationals altogether, and some other foreign nationals. Are people a bit nervous? What's the kind of mood on board?
It's quite mellow, to be honest. Everyone's gotten used to wearing face masks and just trying their best to keep clean and ensure the well-being of themselves and others around them. It's been quite good.
How worried have you been by this coronavirus when you were in China? What were your feelings then?
I thought the Chinese government was doing a remarkable job. I think most countries would be hard pressed to do what they've achieved in such a short amount of time and on such a scale.
And when you were there, just describe the sort of living conditions. Were you in kind of self-isolation when you were in China?
Yeah, I was in self-isolation with my Chinese family, so we were enjoying Chinese New Year indoors, playing games, watching TV, and enjoying some sunshine on the roof of an apartment building. That was an experience.
And so you think generally the Chinese government and indeed the British government, do you think they've sort of handled this as well as can be expected? You don't think this is an overreaction? You think this is, the way that the authorities should have handled this? No,
I think they've done a cracking job. The UK have sort of shown a little bit of green on guild, but it's got to learn from somewhere. And they'll use this case and they'll improve it in the future.
And have you been able to call your wife back in China and tell her that you've landed safely yet?
I've messaged her. I'll call after this phone call.
Oh, all right. Well, maybe you better get off the line to us and give her a call. Ben Williams, thank you very much indeed for being with us. That's Ben Williams, who's one of the evacuees, who's on that plane, one of the 83 British nationals who've been evacuated from China, who's going to be taken now to that NHS facility in Wirral for 14 days of quarantine. We can go back to Caroline Davis, who's at RAF Bryce Norton there, where that flight came in, about 40 minutes or so ago. So Caroline, just talk us through a bit more about what's going to be happening to all these people on the plane.
So we know that there are 83 British nationals on board, that there are 27 foreign nationals. What we understand will happen now is that anyone who is an EU national will be flown on to Spain, to Madrid, we believe. But the British families will be taken off. They're the ones who have they've been evacuated. We understand they'll be taken off the plane. If we've seen the images on the runway, there seems to be 2 ambulances close by. They've had 3 medics on board looking after all of those who were on board, if any of them have felt unwell. We understand they'll then be taken to the Wirral, which is about 170 miles northwest of here. Now, earlier we did see some 7 coaches coming in to here. We understand that a part of the road has also been closed off in Bryce Norton. Now, we don't know exactly how long they're going to be on site here before they are taken on to the Wirral, to the places where they will spend the next 14 days in quarantine. But they'll make that journey, which will be about 3.5 to 4 hours. And when they arrive, we've been given a bit more information about the sort of rooms they can imagine that they will be in. Apparently, the rooms are fully furnished with they'll be given food, Wi-Fi. There'll be toys and games for the children who are on board that flight as well. There'll also be laundry facilities and a possibility of cooking if you want. There'll be kitchens available. We understand that the families will all be kept together, so families will not be split up within that unit. And we understand that it is staff accommodation at Arrow Park Hospital, so it's not directly part of the hospital, it is part of their staff accommodation that is currently empty, that they will be staying in for those 14 days.
And Caroline, we've just heard actually from the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, who's tweeted, a Foreign Office plane has landed after evacuating UK and EU nationals from Wuhan, thanks to Foreign Office staff working round the clock to get them home. Safety and security of UK nationals is our priority. We will keep working hard to provide help and support. That from the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab. And this has been a pretty frantic effort by the British authorities to get these people home, but they haven't got all of the British nationals who are in Wuhan back, actually, only 83.
Yes, we don't know how many British nationals are still in Wuhan at the moment, but we do know that the Foreign Office have said that they are in touch with British nationals that are there. There has obviously been, from what we understand and from hearing from people that have taken that flight or people who didn't quite manage to make that flight, they were told very late on that they would be allowed to travel with their families who might have Chinese passport or dual nationality to be able to make it back. And we understand that the permission to allow those individuals to come on this flight was given relatively late on, which was the reason why it was so difficult. Now, of course, trying to get from your home to the airport in the current situation is very difficult to get taxi services or no public transport in any way to try and get there. And once you do try and make that route, there are various different stops, there are health checks along the way before you can even reach the airport. So many of these people have talked about how they had a short amount of time which they were desperately trying to get transportation to get to the airport and a mad dash to make that plane. We do understand that the Foreign Office did also delay that plane by nearly 3 hours to try and make sure that everybody who wanted to get on board could get on board. But we have heard from families who did try, but ultimately said, look, we're just not going to make it on time. And so they are still in touch with the Foreign Office and hoping that there will be a future flight in which they can get out of Wuhan. But at the moment they are sitting and waiting. Often they are at home behind closed doors waiting to hear from them.
And then just talk to us, Caroline, about these 2 confirmed cases now in the UK of coronavirus. What do we know about that? We gathered that they had been staying in a hotel. They're now being treated in a hospital in Newcastle.
Yes, we understand that they were staying in a hotel in Yorkshire, that these cases were identified overnight and then they were taken to Newcastle for specialised treatment in one of the centres. There are multiple centres around the UK that offer this sort of service. We understand that they're 2 members of the same family and that they are receiving treatment, but we currently don't have anything confirmed about their identity as yet. So we are still waiting for more information to know exactly who these individuals are, if we are ever told any more information about them. We don't know at the moment how many individuals those 2 came into contact with during the last few days, during the last few weeks, however long it's been that they have had the virus and that they may have exposed themselves to other individuals as well. So that will be something that the health authorities will be trying to track down, to try and work out their movements and inform other people about whether or not they might be at risk of also having caught the coronavirus. At the moment, that is still not certain. So we are still waiting to hear more information about these individuals, but we do know that they are 2 members of the same family.
Caroline, many thanks indeed for that. It's Caroline Davis, our correspondent there at RAF Bryce Norton, where that plane has touched down in the last hour, and the evacuees are going to be now moved, as Caroline was telling us, by bus to that specialist facility in Wirral. Well, we've been talking to our medical correspondent Fergus Walsh, who says the 2 confirmed cases in the UK that are now being treated in Newcastle should not cause too much alarm.
We shouldn't individually be concerned at all, because the risk to individuals in the UK from this virus is minuscule. Globally, this is a real concern because it's a new virus and we don't really know the mortality rate yet. The Chief Medical Officer was talking about 2%, but that is a guesstimate at the moment. But in the UK, if you're going home on the tube or a bus tonight, you should be thinking about protecting yourself from the usual winter respiratory viruses like flu that are knocking around. So hand hygiene, not touching your mouth or your eyes with your hands, and being polite to others, coughing into the crook of your mouth. We know that this virus can transmit from person to person. That's happened a lot in China. And there have been half a dozen or more countries where there have been individual cases of person-to-person transmission. The next level here would be if we get sustained person-to-person transmission, a proper outbreak outside of China, then we could be into a situation like we had in 2009 with the swine flu.
Let's just show you the scene there live again at RAF Bryce Norton, where that plane is now sitting there, waiting for the evacuees who are on board from China to be taken off and onto buses. They'll go up to Wirral for quarantine, 2 weeks quarantine. We were talking to one of the evacuees on board as he sat on board there just a few minutes ago, Ben Williams, who was telling us he'd just been in China getting married and that he's now been split up from his new wife, who's a Chinese national. She wasn't able to get on the plane. He was, so he's now back in the UK facing 2 weeks of isolation in quarantine in Wirral, and she's in China, so not the ideal way to start a marriage. Also, we've been hearing in the last few minutes from the Chinese Communist Party, actually, the Wuhan Communist Party secretary, who says that the city of Wuhan, which is the source of the outbreak of coronavirus, should have taken virus containment measures earlier than it did. So that's an admission really from the communist leadership in Wuhan, at least, saying they should have taken virus containment measures earlier than they did. We'll bring you more on that throughout the afternoon here on Afternoon Live. Hello, you're watching Afternoon Live. I'm Ben Brown, today at 3. The first cases of coronavirus have been confirmed in the UK. 2 members of the same family who had been staying at a Yorkshire hotel are now being treated for the virus at a hospital in Newcastle.
They have now been transferred to a high consequence infection unit. That's a very secure infectious disease specialist unit in Newcastle.
An evacuation flight has arrived at RAF Bryce Norton carrying more than 80 Britons from Wuhan, the city in China that's the source of the coronavirus outbreak. Hello, this is Afternoon Live with me, Ben Brown. The first cases of the new coronavirus have been confirmed in the UK. Health officials say 2 people from the same family who'd been staying at a hotel in Yorkshire are now being treated in a hospital in Newcastle. So far, the virus has killed more than 200 people in China and infected 9,000 more. Meanwhile, more than 80 Britons have been evacuated from Wuhan, that's the Chinese city at the centre of the outbreak, are now being transferred to a quarantine facility on the Wirral for at least the next 14 days. They arrived on a chartered plane at RAF Bryce Norton this lunchtime. Well, I've been speaking to Ben Williams, who was on that flight, one of the evacuees, who's now going into quarantine. And he had just got married, he was telling me, in China, and his Chinese wife remains there.
Sadly, we came to the decision to either stay behind due to the very much short notice they gave us for the flight. They literally told us about 9 o'clock in the evening, and it was about an hour and a half did some paperwork mistakes between embassies, and by the time we got out the door, it was very much a close call to get to the meeting point to get on this flight. So sadly, my wife had nothing prepared, and it wasn't right for her to enter the UK with essentially nothing.
So you've been split up then by this evacuation?
Yeah, temporarily.
And is she a Chinese national, your wife, or a British national? Is that why that happened?
Chinese national, yeah, I believe that's why it's happened. They did tell us very much last minute that she would be allowed on the flight, but by the time they told us, we had nothing arranged.
So you might not see her again for a while now.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's only less than a few months. But to be honest, we've been in a long distance relationship. UK to Brazil for the last 2 years, so a couple of months and nothing.
So Ben, you're still sitting on the plane. Have any of your fellow evacuees, any of the other passengers, have they got off yet, or are you all just sitting on it?
I believe we're all sitting ducks for the moment.
Well, that was Ben Williams, one of the evacuees on that plane, talking to me actually while he was still on the plane. Let's go to Caroline Davis, our correspondent who's at RAF Bryce Norton, where that flight from Wuhan landed. And since it landed, Caroline, we've seen the evacuees being taken by a fleet of coaches off to the Wirral, where they're going to be in quarantine.
We have those coaches who have now left. We counted around 7 that came in earlier today. We understand that 1 was left over. So those coaches have now left. The plane landed just before 1:30 p.m. People tended to come out of it in dribs and drabs and sort of 2s and 3s. And then we now have seen that they have left Bryce Norton and headed to the Wirral. That is around 170 miles away to the northwest of here, where they will be staying in Arrow Park Hospital in the staff accommodation vacated there. So we know that those buses have left. According to some of the images that we can see there, sitting next to the driver, there appeared to be somebody who was in a full almost like forensic suit sitting with them. Now, we've also heard that it's not just those individuals who will be in quarantine for 14 days. We do also understand that the military personnel, the medical professionals and other government staff that were helping and that were on board with them, they will also be going into quarantine for 14 days. They will not, however, be going to Arrow Park. They will be going to a different location, which is not being revealed to us at the current time. We know that there were 3 members of MOD staff on there. They were the medical personnel who were assisting those 83 British nationals and 27 foreign nationals on board that flight.
Caroline, we were just playing a clip of that interview with Ben Williams, one of the evacuees, who was saying that he had been split up from his Chinese national wife. There was a degree of chaos and confusion, wasn't there, in China about who exactly could get on this evacuation flight?
Yes, there does seem to be a lot of confusion surrounding who could get on, and last-minute phone calls to people saying that, in fact, nationals who had Chinese passports or dual nationality could take the flight. From speaking to other passengers who were on that flight, we know that some were able to travel with their families who did have Chinese passports or dual nationality, but others were told too late and couldn't get on. Others, it seems, struggled to get the paperwork ready in time when they were given relatively late notice. We understand that the Foreign Office were only given permission relatively late on, which was accounts for why these phone calls were late on to get to these individuals, the British nationals. We understand that those who are still in Wuhan, the British nationals that are still in Wuhan, are in touch with the Foreign Office. Many of them have been talking about whether they want to take future flights or not. We don't have any detailed information about that at the moment, but that communication with British nationals still out there is going on.
Caroline, many thanks. Caroline Davis there, who's there for us at RAF Bryce Norton. And we have heard, of course, today that 2 confirmed cases there are now of coronavirus in this country, in the UK, for the first time. 2 cases. They are both from the same family. They're being treated now at a facility in Newcastle. They had been staying, we're told, at a hotel in Yorkshire. And our health editor, Hugh Pym, has been talking to the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, about those 2 confirmed cases here in the UK.
So as I announced earlier on this morning, there were 2 cases from the same family who were identified overnight, and they have now been transferred to a high consequence infection unit. That's a very secure infectious disease specialist unit in Newcastle.
And what sort of treatment will they be getting? How are staff at the hospital protected? How does it work?
Well, obviously I'm going to not go into any patient details at all, either in terms of their particular situation or their biographical details. But what I can say is that that this could turn out to be, for any individual who has a disease of this kind, it could well turn out to be a relatively minor disease, because we know that there is a 2% mortality rate, 2% of people die. But what that means is 98% of people get better, based on current information, and it's still not absolutely certain, but that looks as if it's the number. So a high chance that people will get better, and a lot of people will end up with relatively minor disease. Obviously some people go on to get more severe disease. We know this from the cases that are being reported from China, and they will tend to have respiratory problems, and if anybody got respiratory problems, then they'd be dealt with as anyone else with a respiratory disease.
That's Professor Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer. Well, hello everybody, this is Afternoon Live, I'm Ben Brown. The first cases of the new coronavirus strain have been confirmed here in the UK. Health officials say 2 people from the same family who'd been staying at a hotel in Yorkshire are now being treated in a hospital in Newcastle. So far, the virus has killed more than 200 people in China and infected around 9,000 more. Meanwhile, just over 80 British nationals who've been evacuated from the city of Wuhan, the Chinese city at the centre of the outbreak, are being transferred right now to a quarantine facility in Birkenhead for at least the next 14 days. They arrived on a chartered plane at RAF Bry's Norton this lunchtime. I spoke to one of the evacuees, Ben Williams, who was on that flight, who's now going into quarantine. He told me he'd just got married in China and his wife is a Chinese national. She couldn't get on the plane.
Sadly, we came to the decision to either stay behind due to the very much short notice they gave us for the flight. They literally told us about 9 o'clock in the evening, and it spent about an hour and a half to get some paperwork mistakes between embassies, and by the time we got out the door, it was very much a close call to get to the meeting point to get on this flight. So sadly, my wife had nothing prepared, and it wasn't right for her to enter the UK with essentially nothing.
So you've been split up then by this evacuation?
Yeah, temporarily.
And is she a Chinese national, your wife, or a British national? Is that why that happened?
Chinese national, yeah, I believe that's why it's happened. They did tell us very much last minute that she would be allowed on the flight, but by the time they told us, we had nothing arranged.
So you might not see her again for a while now.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's only less than a few months. But to be honest, we've been in a long distance relationship, UK to Brazil for the last 2 years, so a couple of months and nothing.
So Ben, you're still sitting on the plane. Have any of your fellow evacuees, any of the other passengers, have they got off yet, or are you all just sitting on it?
I believe we're all sitting ducks at the moment.
Well, that was Ben Williams, one of the evacuees, speaking to me when he was still on the plane after it had just arrived there at RAF Bry's Norton. Joe Churchill is the Minister for Public Health and has been talking to BBC News at Arrow Park Hospital in Birkenhead. That's where those evacuees are being taken right now on buses and where they're going to be quarantined for 2 weeks. This is what she had to say.
basically, we are in a state of preparedness to welcome the UK nationals back to the UK. They've come from Wuhan, which has been at the heart of where the coronavirus has started, and welcoming them back to the UK, but enabling them to be in supported isolation for the next couple of weeks, just till we know that they're all safe and fine, they don't have any signs of the virus, and then obviously helping them get back to their homes in some cases and finding them accommodation in others.
People using this hospital at Arrow Park here in the Wirral and staff working here are wondering how this is exactly going to work. How are you going to ensure that they do stay isolated?
So, as you can see, you've come onto the site. Everybody has been working very, very hard under a command structure to make sure that both the facility is ready to welcome them, but also in those lines of preparedness that the right actions have been taken by clinicians to ensure that all staff are safe. It's hugely important. This is about all our safety. So yes, it's about the safety of those who are coming over from Wuhan, but it's actually much broader than that. It's about the safety of the staff here at Arrow Park, but also the broader safety of each and every one of us. So making sure that we're following the right protocols in a measured way, taking the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, who has regularly been updating everybody, who also has been in contact with the World Health Organization. He's been in contact constantly with the other Chief Medical Officers of the other nations in the United Kingdom, making sure that that liaison he has with them, with the Medical Director of Public Health England and the Medical Director at NHS-EI, all those things are locked together so that we look after everybody's health in the best way we can.
In terms of practicalities, the people who are coming here, will they be able to, they won't be able to leave this building? Will they be treated as one big group? Will they socialise with each other? Do you know how that's going to work yet?
So families will be together. And individuals will be on their own. The exact specifics I'm not willing to go into at the moment, but making sure everybody's comfortable, that everybody has what they require, making sure if people need medications, we're seeing to that, making sure that children have toys, and just an enormous thank you. I mean, I've even been told this morning that people have been ringing the council and saying, can we offer to bring magazines in? How can we help? And actually, it's that collective loveliness of this part of the world and British people in general that really makes you proud, because people are definitely thinking of how they can help in the first place, whilst we all must be mindful of taking the correct medical advice for keeping everybody safe.
Well, that was Jo Churchill, the Minister for Public Health, talking to the BBC at Arrow Park Hospital. That's where those evacuees are being taken right now. Let's go to Caroline Davis, who's at RAF Bryce Norton, where that flight from Wuhan landed, about lunchtime, wasn't it, Caroline? And there are 83 British nationals on board. Quite a long flight for them. And just talk us through what happened to them after they landed.
Well, a very long flight. It left Wuhan at 9:45 a.m. And then, of course, flew the distance to here. It landed just before 1:30 p.m. local time here. And then within about an hour, they seem to appear again on coaches to be taken away to Arrow Park Hospital. Now, what happened in the process in between is not entirely certain. We saw that people were leaving the aircraft in small groups, in twos and threes. At the bottom of the aircraft steps, there were 2 ambulances waiting at the side. We also know that there were 3 medical staff on board provided by the Ministry of Defence to help anyone who might have felt ill during the journey at all. We now know that they are going on those coaches at a distance of 170 miles northwest from here to the Wirral, where they will stay in Arrow Park Hospital in the staff quarters there. We've heard about the sort of conditions they can expect, that we've heard that they will have games and toys for the children, that the families will be able to stay together during those 14 days, but they will be in quarantine for that time.
Thank you very much. Caroline Davis there with the latest from RAF Bryce Norton.